So welcome everyone to our next session, Reimagining Mental Health Crisis Response. And this is being led by Anoli Halper, a neurodivergent and trauma-informed LGBTQ consultant and writer. And I'll pass it off to Anoli.
All right, thanks everybody. It is really great to see the blank boxes that I know you are inhabiting from your homes and workplaces. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. Just give it a minute. Okay. Just moving around all the little Zoom boxes. All right. So this is our agenda for the day. First, we have the intro, and then I'm going to talk about a creative poetry project I've done that kind of tracks the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, over time. Then we'll talk about reimagining and redefining mental illness, some lived experiences of psychiatric survivors, alternatives to conventional psychiatry and hospitalization, and then finally we'll discuss crisis planning through empowerment. Okay, so first we have the intro. So how is this presentation relevant to your work? So, you know, where this whole conference is about this intersection right here, right? LGBT people and survivors of intimate partner violence or domestic violence. And ostensibly we're talking about this, right? But there's obviously a lot of intersection. So we know that there's increased risk of severe mental illness among LGBTQ people associated with discrimination. And I had trouble finding specific numbers around this, although I was able to find research on the fact that there was a heightened risk. There's also approximately 20% of IPV survivors reported experiencing a new onset of a psychiatric disorder after their trauma, and about 1/3 of inpatient psychiatric patients have experienced IPV. And so we see some of these disparities. You're probably familiar with these. You know, I think there's been a lot of discussion in the media about LGBTQ people being at increased risk of suicide, of crisis, of depression, anxiety, etc. So I'm not going to delve too much, but just wanted to flag that. So the other reason I think this is relevant to our work is because, you know, if you're working in the IPV response field, you're coming into contact with folks who are experiencing crisis and severe and persistent mental illness and maybe altered states. And I think there's a really understandable temptation to outsource clients who are presenting with these issues to mental health providers, right? And I'm using this term outsource to mean, like, I feel like there's this, again, understandable kind of emotional response to like get it off your plate because it feels really overwhelming and hard. And so I think part of what we're going to do today is like problematize that response, because I think part of it is that it feels overwhelming and hard, and part of it is that it feels like it's just the most ethical and responsible thing to do to pass folks along to someone who has more expertise, and that makes a ton of sense, right? So I see that there's things happening in the chat. I'm just going to briefly pull that up. Oh yes, IPV is intimate partner violence or interpersonal violence. I'm using it to mean intimate partner violence. Sorry about that. Okay, so I talked a little bit about some of the downsides, but why don't we, so this little speech bubble in the left corner means y'all are welcome to sound off. What are some of the downsides of this approach of outsourcing? So feel free to weigh in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we could unmute you. Any thoughts? Okay, we'll give it another few seconds and then I will tell you the answer. Okay,
Kate
someone
is
in
in
the
the
chat.
chat.
You may lose contact with the client you're serving if you pass them off. Yeah, I think that's a great point. We're losing an opportunity for engagement, right? You have this person sitting in front of you in distress, looking for connection. You are there with them. You have an opportunity to connect with them. And that connection can be a source of strength. It can leave the client feeling rejected or like they're too much, higher risk of re-traumatizing. Oh, sorry, interpreters. Angie says, if you outsource, then that person has even more people to deal with instead of one that can reach. Yes, they have to retell their story. Jen said they can feel like too much. Bethany said client burnout. Carrie said those needing support may receive the message that they don't fit in anywhere or have too many issues. Yeah, absolutely. Folks are kind of feeling rejected, not feeling heard. Excellent, thank you. And so this other question I've been sitting with is like, what responsibility do we have for what happens after we pass them off, right? And I think maybe it has to do with how coercive that handoff is. Like, if it's like, hey, you might want to try therapy, maybe that's different from like involuntarily committing someone or being part of that process. But I think, I think about this a lot as like a white person who's pretty committed to not calling the police. I feel like I have a responsibility to some degree because I know what might happen if I call the police for what happens after that, right? And so I think that's something that we need to weigh, and I'm sure y'all do weigh that when you make these decisions around how to handle crisis. What happens after you involuntarily commit someone, or even recommend them to a psychiatrist who's not like LGBT competent. Yes, sorry. Okay, got it. Sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so just a quick note about terminology. I'm talking a lot about psychiatry, but really, so when I'm saying that, I'm kind of encompassing any mental health provider who can diagnose and treat, right? So psychiatrists can prescribe medication. That's not really the focus. It's more about this diagnosis and treatment. Okay. So then just some stuff about me. I don't know why I didn't start with this, but I am genderqueer. I'm neurodivergent, which means that my brain works differently than other people, and we'll talk more about neurodivergence in a little bit. I have a dual master's in social work and public health from UNC, and I now work to make systems better through consulting on trauma-informed care and LGBTQ issues, and I'm excited that this is the first time I've done this kind of presentation to an organization, although it's very close to my heart. I also really try to be humble. Like, I feel like I know enough about this to give this presentation. I don't feel like I know enough about it to like teach a class on it, So I feel like I trust the wisdom in the room. I value lived experience. I recognize that y'all may know more than me about something I'm bringing up, and I welcome folks to weigh in and share that. I do also want to give a trigger warning, a content warning. We are going to be talking about mental health and suicide, sometimes in passing, sometimes in more detail. And so I recognize that that can be hard for folks. And please take care of yourself. Your cameras are off. You can be like doing yoga, no one will judge you. Okay, and now I want to name some philosophical frameworks that are, I think, a lot about dialectics, dialectical behavioral therapy. So some seeming contradictions that I'm holding in balance. So the psychiatric system is harmful and needs to be dismantled on the one hand, and at the same time, there are good people and resources within it, right? Folks are well-intentioned. There are things that people need. And the system is harmful and needs to be abolished. And people have a right to access what they need from that system because it's the one that we currently have. Thank you for complimenting me on the lizard. Yes, it is an Anole lizard. That is my name. So yes, that is what Mary Lou Pichal said in the chat. The way psychiatry categorizes mental illness is harmful, oppressive, arbitrary, and socially constructed on the one hand. And on the other hand, the suffering that it depicts is very real, right? And that is part of folks' lived experience. Okay. What other seeming contradictions can we hold in balance as we're having this conversation? Do you all have any thoughts? It's okay if you don't. I know this is kind of an abstract question, but if there's anything that you kind of want to throw out there as some framing for this discussion. Okay, someone raised their hand. I don't know how to call on phone. Scott, can you assist, please? Let's see.
Yes, I allowed T to talk.
Great. Go right ahead, T. I think we're having some trouble hearing you. Or I am.
T, you can speak. I'll give you the, if you unmute your microphone. Okay, I'm not sure what's going on there.
Okay, yeah, well, you can feel free to weigh in the chat as well, T, because I know yeah, and so Scott, I think you said, having to make money and buy things to survive, but wanting to end capitalism. Yeah, absolutely. Right, I think it's a similar contradiction, right? Like the fact that I thought about that one, like sometimes people will say like, how can you be anti-capitalist? You're like buying all your stuff. And it's like, yeah, this is a system that we have to use this system, you know? And I think it's similar when we're talking about our need to survive, you know, as folks whose brains are different, as folks, you know, who have mental illness. Yeah, there's a similar need to access a system that needs to end. Okay. And so finally, we can work towards abolishing this system, and we can build an alternative to it in the here and now. And so I love this framework, building a new world in the shell of the old. My mentor in undergrad would talk about this. It's a slogan from the global justice movement. The idea is you can build alternatives to the system that currently exists within that system, and maybe eventually people will just switch over to this new, beautiful, liberatory system that we've made. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about this. We're going to kind of do a left turn and talk about this poetry project. This is the art piece mentioned in the in the agenda. So I did this project where I looked in detail at each version of the DSM, and the DSM is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the Bible of diagnosis for mental health providers. And so, yeah, I want to do just a little bit of framing around this project as I explain it. So one thing that was very apparent as I looked at these different versions is how the number of diagnoses increased over time. So the DSM-1 was published in, I think, 1954. The DSM-5, the most recent one, was published in 2013. And you can see that just the number of diagnoses are just kind of exploding, right? And so I thought that was just kind of an interesting thing about the way that we've sort of constructed mental illness or madness is that there's just a lot more mental illnesses than there used to be, right? And I think we sort of like know this culturally. And so, yeah, why is that the case? So reading a little bit, doing a little bit of research, there were like a few answers to that. So one is, sorry, just moving the chat. So one is that there were some efforts to develop a like scientific taxonomy, and similar to how like there's much more, you know, scientists have a better understanding of like how many species of birds there are. They tried to develop like this very precise understanding of all the different iterations of like psychic pain and suffering, right? Which is an interesting project. I also suspect, although I didn't read this, that there's this need to bill insurance for services because you need to have a diagnosis in order to bill. And so that means that every reason a person could be in therapy has to have a diagnosis associated with it. And then another reason is the financial interest of the pharmaceutical industry. And so in the DSM-3, when the DSM-3 came out, which was in 1980, 57% of the committee members who worked on it had industry ties to the pharmaceutical industry. And when the DSM-5 came out, 72% of committee members had industry ties. And so you can see kind of this increase over time. And so this, I guess, is just a kind of, this maybe seems like a little bit out of left field, but I'm just kind of trying to give some context for this system that folks are engaging with, that survivors, that LGBTQ survivors in particular are, are finding themselves falling into. So this is this really wild graph I'm still in the middle of making. This is mentions of sexual orientation and gender identity in the DSM over time. And so there's just a few things that I really want to highlight here. So I only got to the DSM-3, right, which is 1980. I still have like a few more to go. But I think the most striking and maybe important thing to note is that so homosexuality is officially removed from the DSM as its own diagnosis in 1973 here. But after that, the use of the word homosexuality explodes in the DSM, right? And so that happens for a couple of different reasons. And also at the same time, discussion of gender explodes, discussion of like gender identity. And so the discussion of homosexuality unfolds in a few different ways. So one is that there's this switch to this new diagnosis that's basically like self-hating homosexuality. So first it was like a problem to be gay. It was a mental illness to be gay, but then it became a mental illness to have a problem with being gay. So it's like an interesting kind of 180, like that I perceive as victim blaming. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But then there's this other interesting thing where homosexuality also becomes a symptom of schizophrenia, pedophilia, and histrionic personality disorders. Suddenly it's mentioned in all these other contexts in the DSM. It begins to be pathologized in new ways. And gender identity also is a symptom of schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder. And yeah, like we used to, before homosexuality was removed from the DSM, there was just transvestism was the term. I know that's an outdated and offensive term. That was the only mention of gender. And then after that, there's like 5 different diagnoses related to gender. And so what's another? Oh, and then when homosexuality, if this graph were to continue, you would see this pattern continue where it's just exploding more and more and more. And in 1987, when homosexuality is actually removed from the DSM, they add a new diagnosis for basically drag queens, like for yeah, for queer folks who cross-dress for fun, like a totally new thing that then is later removed. So I feel like there's this sort of panic as like, or backlash that you can really see unfolding within the psychiatric establishment. And so, yeah, let's kind of really drill home. Oh, Hunter says, the DSM was created initially to mainstream diagnoses for people in the military. Then it was expanded to the American general population. We're the only country that really utilizes this material. Thank you so much for that information. I didn't know that, and that's really interesting. So why does this matter? So I really like this metaphor of mutation. I was talking to a friend of mine about this, who's actually going to be here tomorrow. And she said, you know, it's wild how oppression can mutate over time, right? And I think that that's really, really true. And you really see that. So another reason is we still really see the legacy of this evolution in the way that there's gatekeeping around access to trans healthcare, right? So if we go back, you know, we talked about gender identity as a symptom of schizophrenia. So when, even today, when folks have a mental illness that may have psychosis as a symptom of it, they need a letter from a mental health provider kind of testifying that their gender identity is not just a part of their psychosis. So they're not just delusionally believing that they're another gender. And so you can really see the origins of that, you know, back in these earlier versions of the DSM. And then finally, I really feel like this is a form of gaslighting, right? Because it's like the way they switch from like homosexuality being a mental illness to having a problem with homosexuality being a mental illness. It's like, wait, y'all are the ones who said it was a problem like 5 years ago, you know? So that kind of flip, that denial of responsibility, that victim blaming, I think is really damaging. And so I think kind of a corollary to the way that I don't know, what would I say? That defying social norms or having a liberatory framework is punished is this like former mental illness of drapetomania, which was in like the 1840s, I think, was the like supposed mental illness that compelled enslaved people to run away, right? And so we really see the way that this establishment has harmed marginalized people over time. And so the other thing I thought about doing this work and seeing just how sort of arbitrary it was and how the lines shifted and blurred over time, it made me think, like, what if sexuality and gender are only the tip of the iceberg? And what if, like, if I zoomed in on every diagnosis in the DSM, it would kind of look the same and it would feel just as arbitrary and just as cruel, right? And so I think doing this project really, what would I say, really like brought to light for me. It just made me understand that, I don't know, that the DSM is describing real human experiences, but it's describing them in completely socially constructed ways, or that's the conclusion that I came to. Okay, so what I did with this project is I made some erasure poetry. And unfortunately, there's this really cool activity we're gonna have to skip because I'm a little bit behind, but I can give you the link and you can do it on your own time. So erasure poetry is a form of poetry where a poet takes an existing text and erases, blacks out, or obscures a large portion of it, creating a new work from what remains. I'm just going to check the chat. sorry. Erasure poetry can be used as a means of collaboration, creating a new text from an old one and thereby starting a dialogue between the two, or as a means of confrontation, a challenge to a pre-existing text. So erasure can be this very politicized art form because it can subvert a text or sort of talk back to a text. And so this is an example of erasure. It can also be very beautiful. You can see how the person kind of crossed out a lot of stuff and pulled out other things. And it says, spiraling, we experience and keep it. The nothing spirals that resemble you and each other and anxious time. So, fun little question. Guess the source material. Guess what Andrea Blythe was erasuring here. Throw something out there. No pressure, guys. It's okay, folks. I see something about vegetables, food, a cookbook. Yes. Yes, food. Yeah, so it is a Trader Joe's flyer. So I think I liked this example because it demonstrates that you can erasure anything, and it doesn't have to be political, right? Yes, Oliver Bandong says that's amazing. I agree, it's very cool. So I used erasure. I did an erasure of the DSM, of each version of the DSM, and its entries on sexuality and gender. And I used it to tell a story that developed over time called Not a Static Man. That title itself is an erasure of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. And so I wanted to give you a couple of examples of erasures that I did. And so this, you can see the source text, so you can sort of skim. This is the DSM-2, or no, DSM. This is right when it was taken out, when homosexuality was taken out of the DSM and they changed it to the self-hating kind. So it says, this is for individuals whose sexual interests are directed primarily toward people of the same sex and who are disturbed by, in conflict with, or wish to change their sexual orientation, right? And so then I pulled out some words and I created the poem, I find in sexual acts a wish to form other selves. Thank you, Scott, for applauding Not a Static Man. And then, so then the trajectory of the story is someone who is queer and trans coming to terms with their identity over time. And so then we have in the DSM-4 TR, they're in a much more comfortable place. And so that's what this one looks like. Towels, aprons, or scarves are skirts. I play, grow up, tumble, dress, dream, trust, cycle, and proportion. Pair early, pair late, perform, attempt, knit, scars, eat, atoms, apple, ample. Pervasive and mere are ease and odes. I seek and surge, I fetish and merge, I spark. So you can see how the tone sort of shifts over time. Just a little fun fact, this word knit is from the part of the entry on transvestism that said that folks with this disorder may feel sexually aroused or masturbate to fantasy or to like images of themselves doing stereotypically feminine things like knitting. But I was very grateful for the word knit in the text because knit is a really good poetic metaphor. Okay, so this is the activity that we unfortunately have to skip, but you are totally welcome to do it on your own. And I'm going to just, I'm trying to think about how to, hang on, let me. I know you can all see what I'm doing right now. I'm just going to share this in the chat. Okay. Sorry, I just sent that to one person instead of to everyone. Will slow down a little bit. I apologize to the interpreters. Okay. Okay, so now we're going to talk about reimagining and redefining mental illness. So we talked about how the experiences depicted in psychiatry are real, even if the categories are arbitrary. So what are other ways to make sense of them? I wanted to point out, right, as we kind of transition into this section, this slogan from the disability justice movement, nothing about us without us. And I think, you know, it's increasingly accepted that we're increasingly taking it for granted that marginalized people, that folks have a right to kind of describe and name their own experiences of suffering, that they have a right to define their experiences on their own terms, right? And so who gets to decide what racism is? People of color, right? Who gets to decide what homophobia is? Queer people. And however, or who gets to decide what it means to be trans people, right? And at the same time, you know, the DFM is all about us. It's all about people with experiences of mental illness, and it's written completely without us, right? It's written by experts, by other people, and it's all about our experiences, right? And so what does it look like when people with lived experience define those experiences for themselves? Charlie says, because no one is a statistic. Yes. So one resource I want to share with y'all is the Hearing Voices Network. It's for people who hear voices, see visions, or have other unusual perceptions. And this is how they kind of describe and define hearing voices. Voices and visions are personally meaningful experiences that happen in the context of people's lives. Oh, I can't, hang on, sorry. This context can include spiritual practice or religion, culture, traumatic life experiences, social injustice, physical illness, and/or other difficulties. Our lives are not always easy, and living with voices can be very difficult too. The voices I hear can be a nightmare, but they've taught me a lot about the things I need to change in my life. And that's a quote from someone named Catherine. Whatever the origin of someone's voices or visions, the relationship they have with them is key. Voices or visions that frighten or overwhelm us are harder to deal with than those we simply find a little annoying or even enjoy listening to. With help, people can find new ways of relating to and dealing with difficult experiences. So in the Healing Voices Network, folks who experience psychosis or delusions learn to maybe make friends with those experiences through peer support. And so this is a little bit of madness propaganda from this old mental health, like radical mental health collective called the Icarus Project. It says, there is beauty in a crazy crooked mind. Birds with perfectly symmetrical feathers can't actually fly.
I know there's a question in the chat.
Would synesthesia be included in this category? Oh, that's a great question. You mean for the Hearing Voices Network? I don't know. I think they tend to mean more like, healing voices. Yeah, no, Charlie said, I thought you said Healing Voices Network for a minute. No, hearing, but Yeah, I don't think it's as much synesthesia as like, yeah, like more like psychosis. So like hearing, yeah, hearing voices or seeing things that other people don't see. They have a really nice description of kind of who is encompassed on the website. Okay, so now we're gonna watch this video about the Icarus Project.
And the volume, the audio is not coming through, I think.
Thank you. Okay, let me figure out how to do that. Share sound. Okay, it should work now. And let me add closed captions. Okay.
Okay, so I have a limited amount of time, so I'm going to do the best I can to impart as much information as I can to you. When I was 27 years old, I wrote an article in the San Francisco Bay Guardian called The Bipolar World. And basically what I was saying in the article was, look, I've had all these experiences. I'm diagnosed with this thing called bipolar disorder. I take the medications and they seem to help me, but I don't trust the pharmaceutical industry at all. And I want to understand what's going on out in the world, and I'm looking for other people like me. And, you know, I learned this great thing, which is that when you put yourself out there, when you actually are brave or crazy enough to like get up in front of a bunch of strangers and tell some story about yourself, people feel compelled to tell you their story back. And so one of the people who wrote back to me was this incredible person named Jax McNamara. And Jax and I, the night we met, we were both folks, you know, who were really creative, who'd both been diagnosed bipolar, both been locked up. And the night we met, we stayed up all night till the sun rose, and we wrote, we decided to start this organization. We decided to start this website in this very kind of grandiose way that manic people sometimes have, called the Icarus Project. Now, Icarus in Greek mythology is the boy who has wings, but he doesn't know how to use them. He ends up flying too close to the sun and drowning in the ocean. What if instead of seeing ourselves as diseased or disordered, we saw ourselves as having dangerous gifts like having wings? What would that do to our sense of self? How would that change the nature of how we rolled in the world, as it were? So we made this website, and
okay. Okay. I did the captions work. I did turn them on. Okay, hoping they did. And so, yeah, so that's someone talking about bipolar. This is another quote from someone who, awesome, I'm glad the captions worked. This person is autistic, and autism is not a mental illness, but I wanted to share this framework because I think it's really critical and obviously close to my heart. I am a neurodiversity advocate. I believe that neurological differences such as autism, dyslexia, and dyspraxia are natural variations in the human brain. Our society pathologizes these conditions and focuses on trying to cure them. I am trying to flip the narrative so that society stops viewing us as defective and starts to embrace and harness our many strengths and talents. And so neurodiversity goes beyond autism to apply to any, although it was started by autistic folks, to apply to any kind of biological brain difference. And just as kind of this framework that I think is echoed in a lot of these speakers, that there is beauty and strength in kind of brains that are wired differently. Okay, so this is someone with dissociative identity disorder who identifies as, I saw this person or this collective speak, and they identify as an anarchist collective living in one body. So it's very cool.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ali. We're the Redwoods. We're 8 people living co-consciously in one body. Wow. Yes, there's 8 of us. We're a multiple system.
So just to give a little bit of background, in case you all aren't familiar, so DID, or dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personality disorder, and it tends to be associated with severe trauma. And yeah, there's all kinds of theories about it that you could read up on, but I want to share this person's experience.
Describes any group of people, parts, alters, living in one body. Different systems use different language. We use the word people. We find that it's the most humanizing for each of us and allows us to each live to our fullest potential. And we respect the language of each person and their right to self-define and self-determine. I'm going to let some other people share. I'm really excited. Hi, I'm Z. As you can see, we switch pretty easily between each other. That's part of our co-consciousness or co-fronting. And we've been able to do that for about 6 years, and we had hints that there was something going on for a few years before that. It's been a long journey, and we're really excited to share part of it. Here's Jay. Hi, I'm Jay. I'm shy. Okay. So this is a big deal because multiples aren't just like a random one person here or there. It's actually supposedly 1 to 3% of people. We'll get into the statistics more deeply, and I use the word a lot, so I'll try to not do that. I'm excited to just make a channel where we can be ourselves. I think it's really beautiful to be multiple, and I really love all the specific people who live in this body and what we do together. Someone else want to talk? This is Joy. You should know that we've been out as multiple to almost everyone in our personal life for a while now. Our family, our friends, in our dating life. But I don't date because I'm only 13 years old. And it's pretty common for there to be littles in one body. And we'll make more videos about all these little topics. And it's going to be awesome. I'm really excited to get to know you and for you to get to know us and for us to work together to help multiples. This is Ali again. Thank you so much for watching.
All right. Sorry, I just had to grab a drink. Okay. And finally, this is someone with borderline. I'm just going to kind of skim this slide. They say that the myth is that someone with borderline is overly emotional and sentimental, but the truth is that they appreciate the intricacies of psychological bonds, which others cannot. And that people with BPD possess an uncanny sensitivity to others people's subconscious mental content, and that there's even been research on that. And so I kind of just wanted to flag some kind of different understandings within kind of the radical mental health world of the medical model. So some psychiatric abolitionists say the medical model is fabricated and everything that we label mental illness is a response to systemic oppression. And some people, the like neurodiversity movement folks would say, our brains are naturally different and worth celebrating. So some folks are like, don't really believe in the biological or medical model. And some folks believe really strongly in the biological or medical model, right? So there is a lot of diversity within these worlds. However, they all kind of share the belief that this society was not designed for us, and the psychiatric system was not designed for us, and we need systemic change. And so how else can we sort of reconcile? Remember this idea of holding contradictions in balance. How can we reconcile these contradictions? I think that this next quote really illustrates that for me. And so this is from DBT, from the DBT manual by Marcia Linehan. You all may be familiar with DBT. It's an evidence-based practice for borderline and other emotion dysregulation. So the manual says, the natural consequences of judging negative emotions as bad are feelings of guilt, shame, anger, and/or anxiety whenever distressing feelings arise. Frequently, a distressing situation or painful affect could be tolerated if only a person could refrain from feeling guilty or anxious about feeling painful emotions in the first place. Right? So she's like distinguishing between this primary emotion of like psychic pain and this secondary emotion of like shame and guilt and anxiety about that pain. Yeah, great. So I love that Charles said some cultures not only accept, but even elevate this. Right. So I think you kind of, yeah, you're jumping ahead to kind of the point that I'm about to make, which is that the source of this shame and judgment is our culture, right? And our cultural norms. No, you're good, Charlie. Thank you. I appreciate it. So Charlie apologized and I was like, no, it's great. Okay. And so we're gonna move really quickly through this. I might skip some slides just to make sure that we're able to catch up because we're kind of behind. So we know that queer folks and trans folks have worse experiences in psychiatric settings. 9% of trans survivors reported being forced into mental health care. Of trans respondents, so trans folks in general, who had seen a mental health care provider in the past year, 33% reported having at least one negative experience related to being trans, so a third. And 13% reported that one or more professionals tried to stop them from being trans. So there's this term, Psychiatric Survivors, which is like another kind of group that's organizing. And so it's a diverse group of individuals who are current or former consumers of services. They work to gain voice for their experience, raise consciousness of injustice and inequality, and expose the darker side of psychiatry and promote alternatives. And so the term survivors, I really was trying to highlight, although my highlighter color is not really showing up. But that term is really relevant because many people experience engagement with the psychiatric system as a form of trauma. And so this is a quote from someone who identifies as a psychiatric survivor. Western medicine's attempt to manage the trauma in my body when it was at its most acute expression was a massive fail. They were tracking our every move, putting it all in our charts, and they wonder why we think we're being spied on. I love that because I think that's so insightful. Like, folks with psychosis often are being monitored in the way they feel like they are because of their psychosis. And it's like that lack of transparency can really feed that cycle. What I really feel like I need when I'm in those states is a place to rest and someone to listen until I run out of the story and land with the necessarily rugged emotion. And then people to hold me with care as I release those feelings, not an orderly to hold me down to a bed and inject me with drugs in the hip. While I was sleeping, someone opened my door every hour and shined a flashlight on my bed, right? So they couldn't get rest. 8.5% of patients were restrained in psychiatric settings. 8% were assaulted by staff. A 2014 study found that 16 of folks with psychotic disorders found that 69% said that hospitalization was traumatic. And this is a breakdown of things that folks experienced from another 2005 survey. I had trouble finding more recent data. So you can see that these interventions were very common. I think they're thankfully becoming somewhat less common. And then you can see how distressing they are to folks, right? So extremely distressing. So I think this is the most important point, right? I think we have this idea that The hospital sucks, but it's the lesser evil because it's keeping people safe. However, there are well-established bodies of literature highlighting that suicide risk is high during inpatient admission and the period following discharge from psychiatric inpatient treatment and from other psychiatric crisis services. Heightened risk is not limited to death by suicide. In fact, several studies have found increased risk for self-injury and readmission in both adolescents and adults in follow-up periods. We must consider the possibility that hospitalization is itself harmful. So this review of the literature found that hospitalization does not decrease the risk of suicide and in fact may increase it. And so that's because in psychiatric settings, there's a familiar logic of victim blaming, coercion, and control. Sorry, just messaging an interpreter. Yeah, so y'all just asked me for my slides. Let me know how to send them and I am happy to do that. Abolition means that all the cages come down, including those that function under the guise of psychiatric care. And so I'm not going to be able to go through this whole chart, but it's a comparison between incarceration in jails and prisons and incarceration in psychiatric institutions and facilities. And so some highlights is that BIPOC are disproportionately overrepresented. There's disregard for the safety of trans and non-binary people. There's a lot of violence. There's sexual assault. There's limited kind of freedom. Numerous barriers to obtaining healthcare, housing, little power, right? There's all these ways that these systems are parallel to each other. And so finally, I want to kind of highlight for this section, this vicious cycle where discrimination, trauma, and mistreatment we know are really significant risk factors for mental illness. And then when folks seek psychiatric care, they experience more discrimination, trauma, and mistreatment, which can trigger more mental illness, worsening symptoms of trauma. And research shows this is especially true of marginalized people like LGBTQ survivors. Whew, okay, I think that was our heaviest session. Okay, I'm trying to read this little chat about keeping people safe. Nina, I hope I got your name right, says, keeping people safe or keeping us safe from them. Hearing about all the forced restraint and abuse, it's hard to tell who is being kept safe from policies that would allow from this type of response. Yeah, that's super insightful. And I think that speaks to kind of this logic, right? Of like, I think it's the same logic of as incarceration of just like not dealing, like finding a way to look away from people who are challenging to our kind of understanding of the world or who are suffering, right? We don't want to see that suffering. And so it's easier to lock people up. Okay. So quickly, oh God, running out of time. Quickly moving through alternatives to conventional psychiatry and hospitalization. So peer support is really important. So also I'm going to be sharing, so I'm going to move through all of this really fast, but I'm going to share a document that has all the information in it at the end. And so you'll be able to access all the links. So there are peer support organizations. So that search term is really useful. One is this IDHA. I can't remember what it stands for, but it's like an offshoot of the Icarus Project, which we learned about in that video. There's local options like the Promise Resource Network, and there's Trans Lifeline. So another offshoot of the Icarus Project is this organization called the Fireweed Collective. And they provide a really useful crisis toolkit with a bunch of options. They have free support groups and webinars. They have a focus on intersectionality and mental health, not as much on severe and persistent mental illness, although the crisis toolkit does address some of that. Yeah, 20 minutes left. All right, we can do this. We got this, people. Okay, so the Clubhouse model is useful, and there are clubhouses across North Carolina. So if you look up mental health clubhouse, you can find that, and it's also on this handout. This is one clubhouse.
Welcome to Clubhouse. Friends in Action Clubhouse is basically a community of people helping people.
The Friends in Action Clubhouse is designed to help people who have not only severe mental illness, but who are disabled by their illness to where they may not be able to function in the community on their own, or they may not have the skills to live the life that they choose.
It's Kim from Friends in Action Clubhouse. How are you?
It's member driven, so they actually develop their calendar each month. They decide what they're going to fix for dinner.
This is our store area. Members are able to buy snacks throughout the day.
We give them the tools that they need to live in the community, to get educated about their illness, and to find jobs and get back into the work environment.
Make sure you breathe, come in your mouth.
Okay. So that's another kind of peer-based model. And peer respites are another really, really awesome alternative to hospitalization. So it's a voluntary short-term overnight program that provides community-based crisis support. It operates 24 hours a day. So basically, like, instead of a hospital, someone goes to a house that's staffed 100% by folks with lived experience of mental illness. And they have a room with a door, and it's just a place to like chill out. Maybe there's dinner, maybe there's yoga. Like, my understanding is it's just like a calm environment, a change of scene, so that folks can come out of crisis in a way that's kind of empowering and respects their autonomy. And so there is a peer respite in North Carolina that opened about a month ago. It's run by that organization, Promise Resource Network, which is linked to you on the handout. I am not sure how trans-friendly this organization is, so that's a consideration. And I think I tried to call them. I wasn't able to get a hold of them. I think it's worth certainly doing some research on that before you send queer and trans folks there. Okay. All right, 10 minutes. We're going to cover crisis planning. Okay, so so just sound off real fast in the chat. What do you do now when a client is exhibiting suicidality? And I'm about to ask about psychosis as well. So tell me about both. Oh, great. So Mary says that there's a center in Spartanburg, like their peer respite. That's awesome. Yeah. So how do y'all handle it now when a client is suicidal or has psychosis? Any thoughts? Okay. I think my main question is, do you all refer to behavioral health? Okay, you all just refer. I would love space to process. MPCC interview says, I would love space to process as providers the fear conditioned in the field that motivates us and dictates that we send people to the hospital. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, right? I think there's so much anxiety. I mean, it's an understandable anxiety, right? Of like, what, we don't want to be responsible. Yeah. It would be cool to have a conversation about that at some point in the agenda. Maybe Scott could sort that out. So do you all support and validate? Awesome, I love that. That's what Savannah said. Do you all do no suicide contracts by any chance? Yep, if someone just wants to say yes or no. Does anyone do no suicide contracts? No, okay. No. All right, we'll see if there's anyone who does. Because I think maybe I can skip that section. Yes, okay. So I'm just gonna briefly say they're not, they don't work. They're not evidence-based. They're also coercive. So no suicide contracts are, you have a client contract, like agree, maybe even sign, commit to you that they're not going to die by suicide or harm themselves. Safety plan for living. Yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about. Use assess from First Aid Mental Health. Nina says, yeah, I'm not familiar with that. I'm curious. And so, yeah, so as I said, there's little evidence that contracts are effective within a sample of high-risk active duty soldiers, which was just the evidence available. Crisis response planning was more effective than safety contracts. So mental health crisis planning is a really nice corollary to DV safety planning, domestic violence safety planning. And so, yeah, I think the reason I framed it that way is because they're both really based on the idea that the person knows for themselves what they need to stay safe. And if you assist them and support them in thinking it through, they have the answers, right? And that it's not our role to decide that for someone. It's a, you know, they're both interventions based on empowerment rather than coercion. You are your own expert. Yeah. So this is a brief safety plan, and it's most similar to a no suicide contract because it's short. It covers warning signs, internal coping strategies, people in social settings that provide distractions, people to ask for help, professionals to contact, and how to make the environment safe. So it really covers the basics of what you need. And this is available for free online. You may already use it. It's the first one that comes up when you Google. And I have it in the handout. It's also real fast to do. I think a downside of this is typically it's done, it doesn't have to be this way, but typically it's done once someone is already presenting as suicidal. So there are also more extensive options that foster self-reflection, empowerment, and coping skill development. And what I kind of want to encourage here is finding a way to integrate these more extensive programs into y'all's work. I am like a crisis, mental health kind of crisis planning evangelist in this way. Yes, RAP, Jen Jones, awesome. Jen Jones mentioned that I am a huge advocate for RAP. And so that's what I'm about to talk about. There it is, right there on the slide. So RAP is the Wellness Recovery Action Plan. And so it is an evidence-based practice. I think, however, because it's an evidence-based practice, it comes with all of the, like it costs money to get trained and all that stuff, right? However, there is a free PDF of it online that and I linked to that on the handout as well. And so, yeah, there are also some free alternatives to RAP that are pretty similar. This one is called TMAPS. It's by the person who founded the Icarus Project, Transformative Mutual Aid Practices. And I want to just show you all kind of what this tends to look like. How do I feel when I'm most alive? What am I like when I am doing well? What are the most important things in my life? What are some of my strengths? Right? And then they kind of go into, how do I take care of myself? And how do I know when things are going wrong, right? What helps if I am approaching crisis? And so this is pretty similar to RAP. Like, it's all about kind of identifying these moments when things are good, identifying moments that they're hard, kind of building self-reflection, building like a deeper understanding of yourself and your process. So Fireweed Collective has published on their website MAD Maps, Madness and Oppression, and they kind of, rather than talk about what does it look like when you're having a hard time because of mental health, they're like, what does it look like when you're having a hard time because of oppression? So they frame crisis in terms of oppression. I think of this as similar to like that diagram of like, some people think all mental illness is from oppression and some people think it's in the brain. So they came out on the side of oppression. So that language might be more accessible for some folks. And so I just have this example activity. What does it look like when you're doing well? I think that's like a sweet thing. Scott, how am I doing on time? Do I have 2 minutes or do I have slightly more than that?
I guess, yeah, it's just 2.
2, okay. So psychiatric advance directives are amazing. I don't know if you all have heard of them. A psychiatric advance directive is a legal document that documents a person's preferences for future mental health treatment. It allows the appointment of a health proxy to interpret those preferences. So someone writes this document when they're doing well, in order to think through what they need when they're not doing well. So they say, I'm not comfortable with electroshock therapy. I'm not comfortable with being sedated. These are the meds I want you to give me. These are the people who can come visit me. You should let me do yoga because yoga makes me feel better, damn it. Like, you get to say what happens to you in treatment. And so something you could do is fold, like you could make if you implement crisis planning in the context of services, you could fold it into a psychiatric advance directive, have witnesses there to sign, and then it could become a document to keep on file. And if a client does go into crisis and you do need to hospitalize them, you are able to ensure their wishes are respected. You don't lose the connection to the client and you don't harm the alliance that you have with them. Maybe as much, right? Yes, so someone said, this way when you are unwell, you are still in control of your care. Yep, absolutely. It's super amazing and empowering. And so just some last harm reduction options. If you still think you need to hospitalize someone without their consent, consider calling a mobile crisis unit instead of the police. And if you do call the police, ask for a crisis intervention trained or CIT officer. Okay, I don't think we have time for questions. My website is anolihelper.com. And yeah, I do presentations like this. And I also later today, actually, I think it's already up. I'm selling my poetry chapbook on the website for pre-orders. And so if you're interested in reading more, you can buy it there. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. It was really great to chat with you. I really appreciated all of your engagement. Wait, before you all leave, okay, Dylan raised his hand. Dylan, you are welcome to chat. Before you leave, I'm going to share the resources with you. and make sure that you have those. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can email registrants anything that you want to send. Just send it to me.
That sounds great. Yes, and I will email that to you as well. Okay, so it's a Google Doc. Yeah, so it covers all the resources that I mentioned here. All right. Thank you
so much. Sorry, Nelly. Okay, everyone. So this is the end of our webinar session, and you can go move to the different rooms for the discussion groups or the grief circle. Again, I'll put the link to where all the information is in the chat. You can follow that and find the different Zoom links for the meetings that are going to happen now. And I'll see you in one of those. Otherwise, come back tomorrow. There's a separate link for tomorrow's webinar. And thank you everyone for participating. This has been a really good first day. And thank you to the interpreters for all the work that you've done to make this accessible.